Die Diaspora spricht.
Diaspora
Diaspora spricht.
Diaspora's speaking.
My name is Rina Limoni and I'm the host of Diaspora Speaking. In this podcast, together with our guests, we will explore the journeys, activism and academic developments concerning Kosovo, Albanian and Balkan diasporas to attain a deeper understanding of our communities scattered around the globe. In this episode, I spoke to Arbnora Selmani to explore how popular culture infused with nationalist and feminist empowering tones shaped the consciousness of the Kosovo-Albanian diaspora during the 1990s and beyond. Welcome to Diaspora Speaking, Arbnora.
Thanks for having me, Rina.
Thank you so much for joining the conversation today. As perhaps the listeners of Diaspora Speaking expect by now, we start the conversation with 3 questions. Where are you from? Where did you grow up? And because we are Diaspora Speaking, what makes you think about diasporas?
So where I'm from in Kosovo, I'm from Nekaton Offer Lepionit, Diret Babushe Mohajarve. I grew up in northwest London. And what makes me think about diaspora? So many different things, from popular culture to like social media discourse to conversations with family. I think it's something that comes up. You can't get away from it really if you grow up in diaspora. These conversations come up again and again. So yeah, it's simultaneously something I think about a lot, but also not at all at the same time because it's so normalized.
Kam një lotë m'pikon si arë, se në sheku jam shqiptar, e kur malët një mloj bora, për edhe dhe kongës jam ora, e kur malët një mloj bora, për edhe dhe
It was just recently, to draw back to popular culture, you just mentioned that I was speaking to a friend and we laughed how we celebrated New Year's Eve in the diaspora, especially during the 1990s and early 2000s, stuck in front of the TV, watching either Kasetat and later on Radio Televisione Kosovo's celebration programs. I remember as a child buying these cassettes at the Turkish store, then watching them all together was an event itself. They had so much value, especially during the 90s, because it was the only way to keep in touch with Kosovo. And I think after speaking to you, you wrote your dissertation on Shkurtefeza.
Yeah.
Shkurtefeza being one of the most famous folk music artists in Kosovo. She has composed more than 24 of records on diaspora and migration during a career that spans over 40 years. What drew you to write dissertation, Shkurtefeza?
So what it was is, and it's funny because I technically wrote 2 dissertations on her. So she was in my undergrad dissertation and in my master's dissertation. So my undergrad, I did an English with creative writing degree. So there was a creative project element and a kind of critical discussion element. And I was really interested in how do we express like the Albanian diaspora in English and what tropes do we use to convey that. And Shkurtefeza featured quite heavily in the critical discussion because from like a personal perspective, and I think so many different Albanians across the diasporas can relate to this, she was the voice of the diaspora, which is almost like quite funny considering that she's not of the diaspora, but like you said, she had and still has really this massive repertoire of songs about the diaspora, and she's this folk icon. Basically, she becomes almost a stand-in for our feelings about Kosovo and about Gurbet or Mergem or Diaspora, all of those tied together, because she's talked about it so much. And it's really interesting. Her whole career has basically been these kind of like nationalist songs catered to different elements of Albanian Kosovan society, but specifically to Diaspora. So she started off in the 70s with this women's group called Arbnora, I think, and it was by like the Kosovan, it was like the socialist group, and they were encouraged to sing like socialist and nationalist songs because that was seen as what was appropriate for women to be singing at the time. You know, they weren't in any danger of veering towards like taboo subjects like personal relationships, etc. So because of that, because of her kind of standings there, that was what really drew me to her. I had like a real personal connection to that, to the music that she was putting out. And yeah, she's like the first person I think of when you think of like a Kosovan singer. She's like the first one that comes up. So that was really what drew me to her. So a lot of the tropes that she uses in her work, like easily identifiable as Diaspora tropes. And what I found really interesting was then to like partner her work for my master's dissertation. So I looked at these 4 different motifs, I should say, that we see in like Diaspora literature. That was like the initial focus of my undergrad dissertation. I was thinking about, okay, what images really resonate, what's really designed to resonate with the Diaspora audience. And it was always the image of the mother, the image of the old house, home, the land. It was always centered around food, for example, and that was around, and then language was the 4th and final one. And then for my master's, I decided to really like hone in on the image of the mother and the motherland. And I've always been interested in how different cultures speak to each other and how we have like these shared images across different diasporas. So in that, I was exploring how imagery of motherhood and mothers is used in literature and poetry and song about self-determination. And so to that end, I was really interested in the work of Mahmoud Darwish, for example. So we're thinking about Kosovo, we're thinking about Palestine, and how his work also invoked these images of the mother and what that kind of stands in for. And that those to me were like these 2, like at first glance, it seems quite weird to put them together. You have this like poet and then this folk artist, but they're both cultural icons. They're both very emblematic of their respective countries or backgrounds. So, and putting them in conversation was really interesting because you found like teasing out all of these strands, how much there was in common, both from like a socio-historical perspective, but also in the like actual language used itself. So that was where that came in, and that made for like a really fruitful, because I was really interested in, okay, we think about Diaspora literature as both kind of adequately expressing, it's very evocative, it expresses how we feel and the emotions we feel in Diaspora, the loneliness, the homesickness, but in other ways it's also quite prescriptive. This is how you behave in Diaspora, these are the emotions you feel in Diaspora, this is, and how when we think of the mother, this is like a typically comforting image. Actually, what does that mean for women in the literature? Is this actually prescribing a role to women within, like in the second dissertation, I was thinking about the idea of the nation state and women's role in the nation state. What does it mean for women when the predominant imagery is of motherhood and nurturing and like this kind of passivity? And the same with like the motherland. Once you start noticing it, it's like really hard to stop noticing it.
Yes.
Hey, no moski fri, se vidjemne averi, bite bese sendr beut, shedalin zolta beut, bite bese sendr beut, shedalin zolta beut.
E më bëhet zemra mal kur e shoh se populli shqiptar, jo vetëm këtu, po në të gjitha anët e botës, është në gjendje ta çmojë vlerën e vet. Është në gjendje ta çmojë margaritaren e vet që ka në gjiun e vet.
You just mentioned the voice of the diaspora. Shkurteveza was the voice of the diaspora in many ways, especially when you grew up during the 90s. I think She was present everywhere. And to delve a bit long on this, Shkrute lyrics also projecting, as you said, a certain diaspora consciousness, because it was reminding us of the life in Kosovo and our role in this. And I think of Bahunan and Moskifrik, Sekedjem na Amerik. I don't know why this song particularly, because it's so symbolic. And it's almost a plea and a reminder for the diaspora. Do you think this impacted how diaspora was active during the 90s and up to Kosovo's independence in 2000s?
I definitely think the music that was geared towards the diaspora was very much designed to maintain that connection to Kosovo. And in many cases still is. I think even post-war, I don't even know how to describe this period that we're living in now, but it's very much designed to remind the diaspora that Kosovo is their motherland, that's their home, that's where they invest, and that's where their loyalties lie ultimately. It's really clever because the work tends to address diaspora anxieties about belonging and identity. So a super obvious example is Ekamemer in Kosovar, right? I'm doing Robert Chart for Ekamemer in Kosovar. Like really that idea of, oh, but I'm one of you. I'm one of you. This is my home. And really both kind of acknowledging and putting a voice to that anxiety, but also a reminder that we are one and this is, where you mustn't forget where you came from and you mustn't forget how this is fundamentally your home, and it's very essentialist, basically, which most nationalist literature tends to be.
You're right in your assertion. I mean, because it is obvious. It's a construction of Kosovo beyond perhaps its territorial reality. When I think of this, a construction as a body of pain, love, and pride, and that was very much projected into the diaspora. But I am also very much interested on the feminist aspect of your research, because I think that is something that is not delved on sufficiently in diaspora debates in Kosovo. So I find it curious to share with the audiences of Diaspora Speaking. As expected then, these nationalist lyrics very much defined the role of women and the Kosovo-Albanian imagination. These women were portrayed as passive bearers and vessels of the motherland.
It was really interesting to me. Like I was saying, like once you start noticing it, it becomes really hard not to see it everywhere. And fundamentally, what it was in terms of when we're thinking about these tropes is just taking Shkrute as an example continually. A lot of the times, the active speakers in her songs are men. So she's singing from a male perspective and talking about, how the speaker of her songs came to Gurbet as a young man and now is leaving as an elderly man. And the song I'm referring to in particular here is Shkayetana Gurbet. So these songs are addressed to a very particular demographic. And when you think about how women, or I'm going to use the word femininity as a shorthand for women, even though I don't necessarily believe that myself, but it's always in the role of the mother or beautiful Kosovo. So if you think about Oi Kosovo Bokorosha, for example, Kosovo is like really beautiful and it's like this passive, wonderful land that the Albanians will always fight for because they've always lived there. But as Plas Breze, Djal Pas Djale. So in this, you like have this configuration of, passive female land, which the men will fight for and fertilize, etc., etc. So it's just like little stuff like that you see again and again. And it's not so much what's explicitly said, right? it's almost implicit. Though later on there is stuff that comes a bit more explicit in terms of the kind of diaspora behaviour. But if we're just thinking like from a purely nationalist perspective, these are the ones that come to mind. And I know we're going to speak about Adelina in a bit, but I was also thinking about her work, and she's obviously like very, very different from Shkurtefeza. But she also has the song Lavde Oshtaretim, and it's sung from the perspective of the pregnant woman left behind, raising an orphan while her husband's gone off to fight. And those are the images. I mean, they also reflect reality. I think that's also another thing to note. It's not always just conjured from the imagination. During the war, this is what was happening. But she kind of inverses that, because at the end she talks about how she wishes she'd gone to fight as well, which is something that you wouldn't necessarily see in the work of Shkurtefeza.
Salatullah, salamullah, alayke ya Rasulallah, alayke ya Habiballah, alayke ya Rasulallah, alayke ya Habiballah.
I think of this especially as a child. I was very scared of this, obviously, because I just didn't understand, and especially as she was standing in the dark, Shkurtefeza, but how this text placed women at the receiving end as either helpless wives or woeful mothers missing their sons. It's rendering them subordinate to the nationalist imagination. And you just mentioned Adelina, and I think it was reassuring to know growing up that Shkurtefeza was not the only person representing the diaspora or us as women. How did popular culture in the 1990s and 2000s become more diverse beyond nationalist tunes would be my other question. And how did artists like Adelina Selmani challenge traditional norms during this period?
Yeah, so Adelina, I think, is super interesting as kind of this cultural figure in Kosovo, because, I mean, she didn't shy away from talking about patriotic or nationalistic ideas, but she also didn't shy away from just doing whatever. She was very outspoken. She was very... not risque in the sense of, yes, she was like dressing or undressing however she wanted, but she wasn't afraid to take risks, and she wasn't afraid to go out there and be a bit controversial and really subvert the idea of, you know, what you should expect from an Albanian woman on the screen or in music. And one of the most iconic songs, I think, that kind of like relates this is Amanete. You know, she starts off and she's got this like really lovely voice and she's like singing Arabic, and she's coming in the video, she's coming out and she's going to this room full of men and she's like giving them their coffee when she's reading more and she's like all covered up. And then like you have this break and she just like completely takes it all off and she just like starts like belly dancing or whatever, and you're like, whoa, this is for like the 90s. It's mind-blowing. It's completely crazy. I mean, like even 2000s for me. I very strongly maintain that the pop culture as it is today in Kosovo wouldn't exist if Adelina hadn't been there breaking these boundaries and just putting herself out there. I mean, it's crazy. She was like wearing braids at one point. It was people wearing braids in Kosovo. she was like, yeah, very innovative, and you know her songs were very much, you know, not at all submissive. She was, you know, talking about how she's going to have as much fun as the boys, basically, and you know, okay, you're going out, I'm going out too. Or another song when I was thinking about like the link between nationalism, militarization is Ushrin Time do Tabai. The line is, you know, that she's gonna make her own army with Ibrahim Brogovan. So she is like projecting this big image of like this strong, independent Albanian woman, which is such a departure from other forms of popular culture coming out at the same time, really. And you do have like a bit of a spectrum in between, I think, as well. Those are kind of the standouts, and maybe even Shkuta Viza isn't even like the furthest of the traditional, because then you have like someone like Sholet Belule, like even more in these themes and more explicit about it as well.
But I think, despite Adelina, a certain projection for diaspora women from Kosovo, an expectation almost is there. A few years ago, there was this Shyrete Belude song. I don't remember the precise lyric, but I just remember that it was somehow reminding diaspora women to marry within their culture, or Memarni Bur Shqiptar.
Yeah, so that really is, Shyrete Belula is like one of the worst for it in terms of, if you just look at her repertoire, particularly with her daughter. So the song that I think you're referring to is called Nusa Kosovara, and it's from 2018, which I can't believe is 6 years ago. It feels much more recent than that. So they're in a conversation, her and her daughter, and she's saying, "Happy sit, bunny Carter, and then her daughter replies, and then her daughter replies,
oh my goodness.
Yeah, so it's like, I had to, because we previously spoke about, I was like, I need to remember exactly what this lyric was. I mean, it's the whole song's about it, but you have that sense of, yes, like, I always think of folk music as being inherently didactic, especially like nationalist folk music. Well, I think you can't really divide the two, but this is like very explicit in its message that, you know, you're Albanian, come back, you marry an Albanian. So you have that part of it, but then there's also like the kind of oppressive nature of like tradition and culture, because you're then like going back to this like maternal lineage of, yeah, Sikur Tesia, Sikur Hola, Sikur Jushia. This is what's always been done and should always be done. And another lyric in that song is, Edu sofra ne du yelekin, du me vesh de mia yelekin. It's not just, you know, that you must marry within your ethnic background, but you are relegated to the domestic sphere, and you're both purely ornamental and forced to do lots of domestic labor for your husband and his family. It's never just your husband, it's always, and that's who then you belong to them, and they'll do whatever they want with you. And they've got lots of songs like this. Another one is Cikat Kosovara, which isn't explicitly about the diaspora, but it's just talking about how beautiful Kosovar-Albanian ever, that's kind of our shining quality, that we're just so is that no one can shine a candle, light a candle to us, because we're just so beautiful, and there's nothing else there. That's what Cikat Kosovara is all about. Another one is Cikat Bechara. They've got like a whole library of songs about how to behave audience. Yeah. And this one is talking about like I can't remember the exact lyric, but yeah, today you're spoiled and tomorrow you're a bride, so you better get your act together, because it's embarrassing for me as your mum to give you away like this. So it's these are songs from the past 5-6 years. This isn't 90s, 80s, 70s.
And it's ironic, because when we go in somewhere in Kosovo, they are like, diaspora weddings. But on the other hand, this is what is projected for the diaspora. So
yeah, it's like this loop, almost self-fulfilling.
Në det hujt e kemi rrit, ki kujdes bi hapi syt. Hapi syt e bani 4, djallë të huj nuk dojmë për dhomve. Sa nevoj me m'porosit, me tradita m'keni rrit. Do t'shkoj nuse me tupona, si kur gjyshet e zja e hala. Shqipe jam do t'marr shqiptar, tjetër kujdesh në si fal. E du sofrën, e du djepin, du me I vesh dimit jeleki.
So last time we spoke, something that you mentioned is diaspora produced popular culture, the second and third generation. And this has evolved considerably, especially in Germany. Mm-hmm. I think more than the UK. What do you think about this evolution, and how would you place it in current diaspora discourses?
It's really interesting because, and I think you're right in that it is much more prevalent in Germany, probably due to the size of the diaspora, as well as other probably cultural reasons. Basically, someone I think about a lot, probably way more than I should, is DJ Gimio, who is this, I guess he's a DJ, the clue's in the name, but he is this young second generation Kosovo German musician who is really well known for his remixes of traditional diaspora songs. And what he does is he basically takes these messages and repackages them for the new generation with much more, but you always have like the tapana in the background, but this is kind of alongside really synth electronic dance beats, and the central message is always the same really, and it's about, like we were saying earlier, maintaining that connection but in a way that's slightly different, because the ones before were directed more at people like our parents and that generation between. This is predominantly for a generation who didn't grow up in Kosovo, whose ties are through their parents and their grandparents, but also still trying to maintain that connection. So it's that sense of nationalism without, projecting all these other messages of having to leave your mother behind, because your mother came with you and you were born here. So you don't have that necessarily, but what you do have is, your love for your country. That doesn't change, even though Kilin Mergim and so on and so forth. And one thing I noticed, but then I need to double check this because I think what we were speaking about was a lyric change. So maybe if anyone's listening and they could weigh in on this. I'd be curious to learn more because there's the song Ani Morenuse, and one of the lyrics, or one of the central lyrics, is Asnok Dua. They're asking her, she says, the shkurte Feza version is Asnok Dua Ruse, Asnok Dua Pare, Dua Ne Demir Shiptar, or something like that, compared to the DJ Gimio version, which says Asnok Dua Ruse, Asnok Dua Pare, Dua Burin Batsamet Segare. I understood this to be a very deliberate choice. I thought he changed it, but I think you were saying that actually that's probably the original. Either way, it's conscious. I think it's a conscious choice. The central message of the song isn't marry within your own race, continue, that it's about celebrating being Albanian regardless, and that's kind of tailored to a diaspora audience. That message of marrying within your culture doesn't necessarily resonate. To me, it seemed like an attempt not to alienate within the diaspora. It's much more unifying. That's how I see that. But I think that for me is his kind of repertoire is really interesting, and it's always the same kind of beat, but just bringing this again and again. And then on the flip side, then you have other like Albanian rappers or musicians who, it's not necessarily that they're talking about diaspora themes, they just are of the diaspora. And I think we spoke about Azet last time.
Oh yes.
Example, which is like this projection of Albanians in diaspora, or Kosovans in diaspora, or I mean all of it, as being, like very hard, and being affiliated with like drugs and money, and that's like a complete departure from all of this other stuff that we're talking about. And I don't want to say it feeds into, I think it's kind of, I don't want to say it feeds into like existing narratives kind of Albanians in like the UK, etc. But it certainly is an interesting kind of direction to take, I think. But yeah, then on the flip side, you also have, like, if we're talking about the UK, you have Dua Lipa and Rita Ora, who their music itself isn't concerned with diaspora. And that's almost another way of being in the diaspora, right? It's, they're vocal about, Dua Lipa especially is very vocal about her heritage and her background, but she doesn't make music about it, which also seems like not an interesting choice. I'm going to call it an interesting choice in that also seems to say, okay, I can be both. Right, I have this, like, I'm just this global superstar, but I haven't forgotten my background.
Somehow Shkurte Feza remains central. I don't know what I wrote this on Twitter or somewhere else on Instagram, but I was at this birthday or something in Kosovo, and then all of a sudden Mora Fjall comes. And then from Çiçekli, we go to this very nationalistic song.
I mean, it's fascinating because Mora Fjall is definitely not a song that needs to be played at a wedding or a party. It was requested at my wedding. It started playing at my own wedding, and people were like, no one was dancing, at least. People were like standing around commemoratively, and then it was at that point that I decided I needed to throw my bouquet and we should change course. And I think it's almost to people, is this like stagnation sometimes, being unable to conceptualize our relationship to Kosovo outside of the context of suffering and the war. And
that's very well put.
I didn't plan that, that just came to me. We can't even now, there's like repeated references to like the Uchaka and the way the diasporas think of themselves in Kosovo, like, and I think that's because there's this like vacuum that was left kind of post-independence where, okay, now we're not defining ourselves against something. What are we? What does it mean to be a Kosovan that isn't being oppressed? And so I think it's that retardation almost of the consciousness that can't go beyond those feelings and beyond those sentiments. And the only way that we can connect is by remembering. And it's that other side of nostalgia of positioning ourselves as these mourners, basically, and sufferers, even though obviously, that's not the position we're in anymore, and haven't been for a while. Obviously, there's constant tensions and worries about what's going to happen. And obviously, you have Vucic kind of gunning to invade at any opportunity, really, and it's constantly being inflammatory. So, and kind of tensions in the north, all of these things are definitely things not to be taken lightly. But ultimately, I think it's that, have we almost run out of ways to express our relationship with Kosovo? Is that why, when we think of diaspora musicians who are explicitly talking about Kosovo, if we think about DJ Gimio, it's always derivative. It's always harking back to this long lineage of diaspora literature and poetry and music and song. A song, you don't create a song from scratch about your feelings about Kosovo. You just go back to the same tropes and remix and rehash and add auto-tune, etc. But ultimately, you can't think of it in a different way. And it's tricky, and I think also because, in a way, it's difficult to consider outside of those parameters. How do you think about Kosovo outside of a family? And that's very localized, that's very specialized, that's not something that can be shared, that's not communal.
And I think it's a discourse that is very much kept alive, especially, of course, as a diaspora person, you go to Kosovo once a year, but when you go there, you don't necessarily see people speaking about these issues because they have their everyday social issues they have to deal with. But you see it when you look at the digital space, the Albanian Twitter space, I would say, because that's how I access it. It's very confined. What can a Kosovo-Albanian be, and how can this person perform the identity within these confines? And I think you're right, because we need to think and to start imagining ourselves in ways that are, without being negligent, I'm not saying neither are you, but in multiple ways, and how we are evolving, because I think in this, a lot of knowledge gets lost, as this conversation is showing. I mean, it's a perspective that unfortunately is not out there. And this brings us to the end of this conversation. And if you have listened to us for speaking, you know that I asked this question. If there is one thing you would bring from Kosovo to the UK, what would it be?
I thought long and hard about this, and it feels wrong to pick, but I'm going to pick one, and that doesn't mean I wouldn't want the others also. In just like the smaller towns, you have the ice cream machines where it's like the pink and the white, and like 25 cents. I want that. That's what I'm like. Yeah, I think that's what I'd do.
I love this so much.
I love Mr. Whippy, but £2.50. No, thank you. When I can have my pink and white for 25 cents or 30 now. Probably inflation's they go up.
I love ice cream, and I love that ice cream. So I understand you. Even though it's December now, I would love to have one now.
Yeah, I have ice cream all year round. I don't discriminate.
Thank you so much, Noor. This was such a good ending to this conversation. Thank you for joining me in this discussion today.
Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure.